It's amazing how much information we've got just from the first few minutes of being in the inside of the cave. But we'll start when we're ready, and we'll proceed at the speed that the cave tells us.
Deep inside a limestone cliff, a team of archaeologists just unsealed a chamber that has been locked away for 40,000 years. This was supposed to be a routine excavation, but it quickly turned into a high-stakes investigation. The cave held secrets of a species we once called primitive, yet the evidence on the floor told a different story.
They found handprints and drawings that are between 35,000 and 40,000 years old. At a minimum, they could be even older.
One discovery was so profound and unexpected that the mission had to be aborted to save the site from being ruined. What was left behind by the ancient residents was a message in stone that proves we were never alone in our brilliance. Silent Tome opens. The crazy part is that they found a large whelk shell sitting right in the middle of the floor. Now, for starters, this might not sound like a big deal. But here is the deal. This shell was a sea snail, and it was found deep inside the cave, miles away from where it should have been. It did not get there by accident, it was brought there by a Neanderthal. This discovery was so pristine and so fragile that the scientists had to abort the mission. They realized that if they kept digging without a new plan, they would destroy the most important snapshot of ancient life ever found. They had to stop everything to make sure they did not ruin a 40,000-year-old mystery. What most people do not realize is that the Neanderthals were not the grunting brutes we see in movies.
The first discoveries were here, and what we're doing is now coming back to this particular area, trying to understand a little bit more of what this family of Neanderthals, or these families of Neanderthals, were doing in this particular area.
They were smart, and this cave proved it. The way the bones were laid out and the presence of that shell suggested they were planning, storing food, or maybe even performing rituals. Everyone is obsessed with the idea that we are the only smart ones, but the Vanguard Cave discovery proves otherwise. The team saw deep claw marks on the limestone walls too. Something had been trapped in there, or maybe something was being kept there. It felt less like a cave and more like a high-tech laboratory for survival. And that is putting it lightly. The scientists knew that every step they took could crush a piece of history that had survived since the Pleistocene. They were looking at a world where sea levels were much lower and the Mediterranean Serengeti was full of life. This cave was the ultimate fortress. But the shell was the real kicker. It showed that these ancient people were traveling to the coast and bringing back resources, not just for food, but for something more. It was a key detail that suggested they had a culture and a sense of home. Nobody expected this to happen, but the mission change was necessary. They had to shift from digging to preserving. This was hands down the most significant find in the region for decades. The urgency was real because the site was so sensitive to light and air. They needed to seal it back up or find a way to study it without touching a single grain of sand. This was just the beginning of a much bigger story about who these people really were. Everything they found inside that chamber started a chain reaction of new questions. If you think the shell was impressive, wait until you hear about the tar factory. In the same cave complex, researchers found a 65,000-year-old hearth. It was not just a fire for warmth, this was a specialized structure designed for pyrolysis. That is a fancy word for heating something up without any oxygen. They were using gum rock to create a birch like tar. Basically, they were making the world's first industrial glue. It is not that simple though, because making this tar requires a very specific temperature. If the fire is too hot, the tar burns. If it is too cold, it never forms. The crazy part is that this proves Neanderthals had advanced chemical knowledge tens of thousands of years before modern humans even showed up in the area.
Anthropologists have long believed that our Neanderthal ancestors were really smart and had high levels of cognitive development.
They used this sticky tar to glue stone points onto wooden shafts to make spears. They were engineers. They understood how to manipulate the environment to create tools that were more than just rocks and sticks. This tar factory had channels and walls to control the airflow, showing that it was used over and over again. This was a tradition passed down through generations. What most people do not realize is that this technology was hands down better than anything else on the planet at the time. They were hunting red deer, horses, and even seals with these composite weapons. They were not just lucky, they were prepared. The hearth showed evidence of repeated use, which means they had a stable society that valued innovation. It makes you wonder how much else they knew that we have totally forgotten. So, here is the deal. When we look at these ancient sites, we are seeing the birth of human chemistry. The Neanderthals were experimenting with materials and finding ways to make their lives easier. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. For starters, they were using local plants to create adhesives that could withstand the impact of a hunting trip. That takes a lot of trial and error. And get this, the design of the hearth was so efficient that it could compete with some modern primitive technology. It is easy to think of the past as a simple time, but it was actually very complex. These people were watching the fire, adjusting the wood, and waiting for the perfect moment to collect their prize. They were the first ones to realize that heat could change the nature of a material. But here is the catch. This was happening in a cave that most people thought was just a place to sleep. It was actually a workshop, a school, and a home all in one. This level of intelligence was not just limited to making tools and hunting. Marks in the deep. In the deep dark of Gorham's cave, there is a mark on the wall that changed history forever. It is a cross-hatched pattern carved into the rock over 39,000 years ago. For a long time, people thought that only modern humans could create art. They thought we were the only ones who could think in symbols. But here is the deal. This engraving was made by Neanderthals. It consists of 54 deliberate strokes of a stone tool. Scientists tried to recreate it and found that it was not an accident from sharpening a tool. It was intentional. It was art. And, get this, the crazy part is that this art was made long before we ever arrived in Gibraltar. It proves that Neanderthals had abstract thoughts. They were marking their territory or maybe telling a story. See, it is not that simple to just carve into hard limestone. It took time, effort, and a clear vision. What most people do not realize is that this hashtag carving is the earliest confirmed piece of Neanderthal art in the world. It was a WTF moment for every archaeologist on the site.
They found handprints and drawings that are between 35,000 and 40,000 years old. At a minimum, they could be even older.
Basically, this carving means they had a sense of self and a sense of place. They were not just ghosts in the landscape, they were leaving a legacy. For starters, it shows that their brains were wired very much like ours. They saw a blank wall and decided to put something on it that would last forever. And that is putting it lightly. We are talking about a species that lived through brutal ice ages and still found the time to create something beautiful. Everyone is obsessed with the idea that humans are special because of our imagination. But the Neanderthals had it too. They were using pigments and feathers for decoration as well. In the cave, researchers found bird bones with cut marks that were not for meat. They were harvesting feathers, likely from eagles and vultures. They wanted to look good, or they had a social ranking system that required symbols. It was a key detail that showed they had a culture as rich as any modern tribe. But here is the catch. Even with all this intelligence, they were still facing a world that was changing way too fast. They were symbols of resilience, but they were also living on the edge of a cliff. The cave was their final refuge, a place where they could hold on to their way of life while the world outside turned cold and strange. As the environment shifted, the Neanderthals had to make one last stand. Gibraltar was the last place on Earth where Neanderthals lived. While the rest of the species was disappearing across Europe, a small group held out here until about 24,000 years ago. That is 16,000 years later than anyone expected. It was a Mediterranean Serengeti that kept them alive. The climate was better, the food was plenty, and the caves provided perfect shelter. But they were isolated. Genetic data shows that these last populations had very low diversity. They were the last of their kind, a small band of survivors in a world that had moved on. What most people do not realize is that they did not just vanish into thin air. They were pushed to the edge by rising sea levels and new competition. But the crazy part is that they are still with us. Most people today have about 2% Neanderthal DNA. They did not just go extinct, they merged with us. For starters, we carry their genes for immune systems and skin types. They gave us the tools to survive in new environments, and we carried their legacy in our blood. It is not that simple, though. A study from 2026 suggests that genetic mismatches might have made it hard for them to keep their population growing. Their immune systems were different, and that might have caused problems when they met modern humans. But here is the deal. They were a successful species for hundreds of thousands of years. They lasted much longer than we have so far. Hands down, they were one of the most resilient groups to ever walk the planet. So, here is the catch. If they were so smart and so strong, why did they end up in a cave in Gibraltar as a final refuge? It was likely a perfect storm of climate change and shifting territories. The coastal plains they hunted on are now under the sea. Their world literally drowned, but even in their final days, they were still making tools and still creating. They never gave up. They were fighters until the very end. Basically, the Gorham's Cave Complex is a monument to their survival. It shows us that the line between us and them is very thin. We are just two different versions of the same story. And that story is still being written as we find new chambers and new artifacts in the sand. The final secrets of the Neanderthals are still waiting to be discovered. What lies beneath? Today, the work at Vanguard Cave continues, but with a new sense of respect. The scientists are using AI and three-dimensional modeling to look at the sediment without destroying it. They are moving slowly because they know they only get one chance to get this right.
It's like walking into a ready-made laboratory. Nobody, no human, has touched it for 42,000 years. So it's completely untouched.
The 13-meter chamber is just one part of a massive system that could hold even older secrets. There are still many rumors in the air, but what many can confirm is that we have barely scratched the surface. We are looking at a history that is 40,000 years old, and it still has the power to shock us. What most people do not realize is that this discovery is not just about the past. It is about understanding how we handle change. The Neanderthals survived for a long time, and then they didn't. We can learn from their adaptability and their mistakes. See, the thing is, I wonder if we are missing a key detail about our own future by not looking closely enough at theirs. They were masters of their world, just like we are of ours. But here is the catch. The Earth eventually takes everything back, sealing it in sand and stone. The discovery in the cave was so big that it changed the mission from a simple dig to a global event. It reminds us that we are part of a very long chain of life. For starters, it makes you feel small to stand in a room that has been silent for 40,000 years. It is a reminder that we are just visiting. The Neanderthals were there first, and they left the lights on for us to find our way. And get this, the crazy part is that there might be even more chambers hidden deeper in the rock. The Rock of Gibraltar is like a giant Swiss cheese, full of holes and secrets. We might find more art, more tools, or even more shells that tell us where they went. But until then, we have to protect what we have found. It is a fragile link to a species that was almost exactly like us. So, here is the deal. We owe it to them to get the story right. They were not primitive, they were our cousins. They were smart, they were artistic, and they were brave. And that is putting it lightly. They were the original masters of the Earth. Could the secrets we find in these caves actually be a warning for our own future? Make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated on this ancient mystery.